Okay, beautiful. And now we're going live. Welcome, everyone. Happy Sunday. It is the first day of Rizwan. Baha'is around the world are celebrating the first day of Rizwan today as we commemorate this beautiful 12-day holiday for Baha'is around the world. We're so happy to have with us Ms. Violetta Zain as we continue on this second session of the Greatest Holy Leaf. We've covered quite a bit last week, and we're going to cover a lot more because this is a series that will go on till the end of May. Now, it is again April 20th. We're expecting about 7 sessions, and this is session 2. So we welcome all of you who have just joined us to please look at our playlist online. You can go to clearwaterbahais.org to find our YouTube and Facebook pages. With that being said, clearwaterbahais.org also has the information about these sessions and how to join the Zoom. If you have not seen our Zoom link, you can find it very easily on clearwaterbahais.org. You could also, since we're hosting these at 11 a.m. on Sundays, you could go under our activities and events and click on the Zoom link for the 11 a.m. session. With that being said, again, Violetta, we're so happy that we're going through this, and we know that this is also available on the Utterance Project website. So, with that being said, if there's nothing more to introduce for our beautiful guests who are joining us today, we look forward to the next session, session number 2 of The Greatest Holy Leaf.
Thank you so much for this wonderful introduction. So yes, this is a illustrated chronology on the life of the Greatest Holy Leaf, and there are 13 parts on the website on the Utterance Project, and I have condensed them into 7 presentations. And today we're going to look at the entire ministry of Baha'u'llah. This is part 2 from 1863, the Declaration of Baha'u'llah, to 1892, the Ascension of Baha'u'llah. And the first part is Istanbul. And Istanbul is the place of Baha'u'llah's second exile, and we're going to see how they get there and what happens when they get there. Bahíyyih Khánum leaves her home. Baghdad had been the city where Bahíyyih Khánum had lived since she was 7 years old. It had been her home through very spiritually trying times and also wonderful times. It had been the place where her father had been attacked, but also where her father had rebuilt the Babi community. And she had spent almost her entire childhood in Baghdad from the age of 7 to the age of 17. It was a place where she had people she loved that she was now leaving, and she was being led into Baha'u'llah's exile to Istanbul, into the unknown, farther away than she had ever been from her native land. Bahíyyih Khánum would have to cope, along with her delicate mother Asíyyih Khánum, with the rigors of traveling in a howdah, a sort of tent built on wooden slats on the back of a mule, jostled for 1,600 kilometers, for hours and hours on end, day after day, for 3 months. The March of the King of Kings. 2/3 of the Greatest Holy Leaf's journey to Istanbul were from Baghdad to Samsun on the Black Sea, about 1,600 kilometers, 990 miles. And these are the only stops that we are aware of. Now entering into Turkey and crossing the eastern part of Turkey to the shores of the Black Sea. The last third of the journey would be from Samsun to Istanbul, 800 kilometers, or about 490 miles by ship. And the total, of course, would be 1,100 kilometers, or 1,300 miles. The caravan of the Greatest Holy Leaf probably stopped 60 times in 3 months. It was an ordeal, especially for the women, and now they arrived in Istanbul, the second exile. They arrived on the 16th of August, 1863. They first lived in one small house, then moved to another house, but their stay in Istanbul was destined to be very short because Haji Mirza Hussein Khan, whom you see here, the Persian ambassador in Istanbul, had been plotting against Baha'u'llah. He's the one who managed to get Baha'u'llah exiled a second time. And now that Baha'u'llah was in Istanbul, Haji Mirza Hussein Khan was on the offensive again, and he was allied with two ministers of the Sultan, Ali Pasha, the prime minister, and Fuad Pasha, the foreign minister. These three men, the Persian ambassador and two ministers of the Sultan, pressured the Sultan until he banished Baha'u'llah a third time to Edirne. So they only stayed 4 months in Istanbul, and he banished Baha'u'llah and his family and the Baha'is in the middle of winter, which brings us to part 2, Edirne. This is the place of Baha'u'llah's third exile. And Bahíyyih Khánum, her family, and the Baha'i exile left Istanbul on a snowy morning of December 1st, 1863, in the middle of the coldest winter in 40 years. It was so cold that winter in December 1863 that 90-year-olds could not remember a colder winter in their lifetimes. Animals froze to death in the snow in Turkey and Persia. Entire regions were covered in ice for days, and in Diyarbakir, a river remained frozen for an entire month. Heavy snow fell through most of the journey, and the exiles had traveled from Baghdad in summer clothes, and they still had those summer clothes, and so they were battered by ice, battered by rain. They were starving. They lacked food during the journey. The wells and the rivers along their route were frozen. The only way of obtaining water was to melt ice with a torch. And the conditions of their travel were very undignified. Some of the exiles had to travel in wagons, kind of like a wagon you see here. It's an early 20th century picture. These kinds of wagons were reserved for carrying goods, and some exiles were carried like goods. And Baha'u'llah wrote about this in a tablet he revealed for a ruler. So they left Istanbul on the 1st of December, 1863, and it was only 149 miles, 240 kilometers. But as we're going to learn with the exiles of Baha'u'llah, the length of the journey does not describe the suffering, because the longest journey they ever traveled was the overland from Baghdad to Istanbul, was 2,000 kilometers, 1,300 miles. It was actually pleasant for most of it. Baha'u'llah was well received. They traveled in mules on howdahs. The two shortest distances they would ever travel would be the distances from Istanbul to Edirne and from Haifa to Akká. And the two shortest distances were the two worst journeys. So they traveled a few stops. We don't know any more of them, but in between all of these were several other stops until they finally arrived in Edirne 12 days later on the 12th of December, 1863. And this is very important because this is one of the few testimonies we have from Bahíyyih Khánum's own lips about this whole period of time in her life. She says, being interviewed, she was interviewed twice in her later years, once by Myron Phelps through the Countess Cannavaro, and once by Lady Blumfield. The journey to Adrianople was the most terrible experience of travel we thus far had. It was the beginning of winter and very cold. Heavy snow fell most of the time, and destitute as we were of proper clothing or food, it was a miracle that we survived it. We arrived at Adrianople all sick, even the young and strong. My brother once again had his feet frozen on this journey. So Abdu'l-Bahá suffered frostbite a second time. The first 2 years in Edirne. This is a very interesting photograph because it was taken by Martha Root in 1933, I believe, when she went to Edirne to retrace Baha'u'llah's footsteps and find all the places that he lived. And so a lot of the information that we have about Bahíyyih Khánum's stay in Edirne comes from Martha Root. This is the site of the old Khani Arab caravanserai in Edirne, where Baha'u'llah and Bahíyyih Khánum and the family spent their first 3 days in this 2-story caravanserai, sort of a motel for animals outside of the city. Then the 11 members of the Holy Family were moved to a very, very inadequate house in the Muradiyah neighborhood of Edirne. And the house was worse than a prison. It was surrounded by soldiers. They were eating prison food, which was just vile. They were constantly cold and hungry. There was so much vermin in the house. And Bahíyyih Khánum described this house as well. These are the ruins of the house of Muradiyah at the time of Martha Root's visit. That winter was a period of intense suffering due to cold, hunger, and above all, the torments of vermin, which the house was swarming. These made even the days horrible and the nights still more so. When they were so intolerable that it was impossible to sleep, my brother, Abdu'l-Bahá, would light a lamp which somewhat intimidated the vermin, and by singing and laughing, seek to restore the spirits of the family. By June 1864, Bahíyyih Khánum and her family had found a better home called the House of Amrullah, which translates as the House of God's Command, and it was in the neighborhood of this famous mosque. When Martha Root visited Edirne, Mustafa Beg was still alive, and he had been a child during the time of Baha'u'llah's exile. He was Baha'u'llah's neighbor. He said that in this house, Baha'u'llah had a soup kitchen for the poor during his time in Edirne. But of course, after their first 2 years, there was an assassination attempt on the life of Baha'u'llah. For 2 years since Baha'u'llah's declaration in the Garden of Rizwan, Mirza Yahya and Sayyid Muhammad had stayed quiet. In the face of Baha'u'llah's majesty and supremacy, and in the face of his declaration, they had retreated into the background, but that did not mean that their hearts had quieted. By the winter of 1865, Mirza Yahya had become obsessed with a single thing: poisoning Baha'u'llah to gain control of the Baha'i community. He knew that Baha'u'llah's brother and Bahíyyih Khánum's uncle, Mirza Musa, who you see on this picture here, was extremely knowledgeable about medicine and herbs. And so, under false pretenses, he started visiting Mirza Musa and asking him about the effects of certain herbs and poisons. And then, very unusually for him, Mirza Yahya began to invite Baha'u'llah to his home. And on one of his visits, around December 1865, Mirza Yahya served Baha'u'llah tea in a cup he had smeared with poison. Baha'u'llah was seriously ill for 21 days with severe pains and high fevers, and the aftermath of the poisoning would leave him with a shaking hand until the end of his life. His condition was so severe that the family called on a foreign Christian doctor named Shishman. The doctor was so shocked by Baha'u'llah's livid skin tone that he fell to his feet and declared his case was hopeless, and he left Baha'u'llah's bedside without prescribing a remedy. Now, incredibly, Mirza Yahya did not stop at Baha'u'llah's poisoning. He did 2 more poisoning attempts. One, he tried poisoning the well of the House of Amrullah. This is just a well in the 19th century, not the well of the house. And inside the house, of course, lived the greatest holy leaf. Now, that attempt failed. Apparently, he was just he didn't know what he was doing, and only a few Baha'is had strange symptoms. So then he tried to do something else that was a terribly bad idea. He went to see this man, Ustad Muhammad Ali, who was Baha'u'llah's deeply, deeply faithful barber. And he asked him if he would kill Baha'u'llah for him, and he could not have picked a worse person to ask. When Ustad Muhammad finally understood what Mirza Yahya was sort of obliquely pointing at and hinting at, he almost killed Mirza Yahya on the spot. But then he went and told Baha'u'llah's brother, Mirza Musa, who told him to keep it quiet, but he couldn't keep it quiet, and he told the rest of the Baha'is. And what this does at this point is that there is now a division, because Mirza Yahya has sort of made public his desire to kill Baha'u'llah and to have him killed. And the separation that is starting, this crack that is forming, is going to get worse. And something called the Most Great Separation is about to take place. This is an event that is going to have permanent consequences on the history of the faith. So In March 1866, the Most Great Separation took place. When Baha'u'llah was better, had recovered sufficiently from his poisoning attempt, he revealed an extremely important tablet called the Suri Amr, the Surah of God's command. And he revealed it for Mirza Yahya, informing Mirza Yahya formally of his station as the one promised by the Bab, him whom God shall make manifest. Mirza Yahya not only rejected Baha'u'llah's declaration, but made a counterclaim to that revelation, saying, no, actually, I also have a revelation from God. And Shoghi Effendi called this event the signal for the open and final rupture between Baha'u'llah and Mirza Yahya, a rupture that marks one of the darkest dates in Baha'i history. Why does the Guardian tell us this is one of the darkest dates in Baha'i history? Because by September 1867, Baha'u'llah has been forced to expel both Sayyid Muhammad first and Mirza Yahya second, and officially brand them, designate them covenant breakers. So for the first time in the Baha'i dispensation, if you look at this picture here, this picture represents faithful followers of the covenant and unfaithful covenant breakers. There is now, for the first time in the history of the faith, a division between faithful Baha'is and covenant breakers. And this most great separation is important to us because it had a lasting effect on the greatest holy leaf. Bahíyyih Khánum, and this is from the words of Shoghi Effendi describing the effect that this most great separation had on her. Bahíyyih Khánum had been an unfailing spring of grace and loving kindness to her family on the one hand, and to the Baha'i community on the other. And throughout the years between Baha'u'llah's poisoning and the end of the Most Great Separation, Bahíyyih Khánum had endured intense stress and deep-seated sorrow. And the Guardian tells us that her lovely form was worn away to a shadow. He uses the word shadow. As the Baha'i community split into faithful believers and covenant breakers, Bahíyyih Khánum was an immovable pillar of strength. She did not hesitate. She did not wither. She just worked harder and harder in servitude and sacrifice. And she captivated hearts. She won over people who were hesitating. She destroyed doubts and misgivings. She led the community. She was filled to overflowing with the mercy of Baha'u'llah. So we see that her role at this point is a unification role, which is very interesting because statement after statement in her later life is really going to emphasize the unifying power of the greatest holy leaf's presence. And we see this very clearly with the most great separation when she is very young still. She is a teenager. The influence of Bahíyyih Khánum's pure and loving kindness transformed unmoving and unyielding believers into passionate lovers of Baha'u'llah. She had a very staunch faith, a very calming presence, another lifelong characteristic of the greatest holy leaf, and a forgiving attitude. But her health had begun to be affected by the rigors of the journey all the way to Edirne. So this is a journey that would have had a permanent effect on her. And the storms of her years in Edirne imprinted themselves into her consciousness. And to the end of her life, she would carry on her angelic face these marks of intense spiritual and physical hardships she experienced in that city. And we forget Edirne is in Europe. So for 5 years, Baha'u'llah lived in the European continent. And this is where she experienced the first batch of great suffering that imprinted themselves on her soul. Of course, in the history of the faith, another constant pattern is victory follows crisis. And after the crisis of the most great separation, the biggest crisis of Baha'u'llah's ministry, really, follows the greatest victory of Baha'u'llah's ministry, which is the third phase of his proclamation. Now, why is it the third phase of his proclamation? Because according to Shoghi Effendi, Baha'u'llah's proclamation was unrolled in three phases. The first phase was a very local phase. It was the declaration of Baha'u'llah to the Babis of Baghdad, who had been transformed by him since 1856 into a Baha'i community, from Babi to Baha'i through Baha'u'llah's agency. The second phase was to the Babis in the country of Persia, chiefly through the teaching journeys of Nabil. And the third phase was the proclamation of Baha'u'llah to the kings and rulers of the world. So it went from a local phase to a national phase to a worldwide phase. And after the most great separation, the biggest crisis in Baha'u'llah's ministry, came the biggest victory. And here, from all throughout Baha'u'llah's ministry, are examples of revelation writing. And this extraordinarily prolific phase of revelation, symbolized by this revelation writing of Mírzá Agha, who's sweeping his hand across the page as Baha'u'llah reveals, the proclamation begins with three major proclamatory tablets, which are revealed in Edirne before Baha'u'llah is banished for the fourth time. The first tablet, very well known, is the Suri Muluk, the Surah of Kings, addressed to the kings and rulers of the world. The second major tablet revealed in Adrianople or Edirne is the first tablet to Napoleon III, the ruler of France. And the third tablet, well known and revealed in Edirne, is the Lawh Sultan, the tablet to Nasruddin Shah, made famous by the fact it was delivered to Iran by Badi. But this happened later when Baha'u'llah was in the most prison, which is what we are about to talk about now in part 3. So shortly after Baha'u'llah's victory and the beginning of his proclamation, another crisis, which is the fourth exile. One day, in the middle of August 1868, Bahíyyih Khánum was quietly sitting at home with her family when all of a sudden they heard the loud and discordant sound of military bugles being sounded outside the house. They looked outside the windows of their home, and they had been completely surrounded by a large number of Ottoman soldiers with watchmen posted at the gates. The greatest Holy Leaf later said, "This trouble broke with the suddenness of a tornado upon us. Our first thought was that the life of the Blessed Perfection, or Abbas Effendi, was threatened." So the first thing they thought was that Baha'u'llah or Abdu'l-Bahá were endangered. But the thing is, Baha'u'llah had just been exiled a fourth time. And in the middle of this exile, there is a really incredible story. And it's a story of the greatest Holy Leaf and the man who tried to kill himself. Shortly before leaving Edirne towards his final exile, Baha'u'llah explained with so much love to the Baha'is that some of them would have to stay behind. One of these Baha'is was very, very devoted and just loved Baha'u'llah deeply. And he's a very sensitive man, and his name was Haji Jafar Tabrizi. So when Baha'u'llah explained that some of them would have to stay, something broke inside of Haji Jafar's soul. And he couldn't bear to live in the presence of Baha'u'llah, and he decided he would rather not live at all, and he decided to kill himself. So he took a razor and put his head out of a window that gave onto the street and tried to slice his throat. He didn't manage, but what happened was this. Hussein Ashchi was a teenager at the time. He would end up serving the Holy Family for 70 years, but he was one of the Holy Family's cooks. He made broth. And he had been sent on an errand. The greatest Holy Leaf was already assuming her responsibility in the kitchen, cooking for everyone. And she had sent Husseini Ashchi, because he was such a small kid, he was a teenager, he did little things for her, like count the number of people who needed to eat. So she said, go and count the number of people who are going to come and eat. And he saw Haji Jafar's suicide attempt. And the greatest Holy Leaf was in the kitchen. So she was waiting for Husseini Ashchi to come back and tell her how many people she needed to cook for. But Husseini Ashchi had just seen the body of Haji Jafar, so he's just frozen in shock. He can't move. So the greatest Holy Leaf waits as long as she can wait, and then she sends a Baha'i woman to look for Husseini Ashchi. What happened to him? He disappeared. So when the woman arrives and sees Husseini Ashchi, but she also sees the bloody body of this Haji Jafar, she falls unconscious. The greatest holy leaf, meantime, is still in the kitchen. And she's now lost not only Husseini Ashti, but the woman she sent after Husseini Ashti. So she sends another woman, a Christian maid, in search of the strangely absent Husseini Ashti and the strangely absent woman that she had sent. So the Christian woman goes and she finds the woman, the Baha'i woman, and Husseini Ashti, and she sees the guy who tried to kill himself, and she also falls unconscious on the ground. So now there's 3 people who can't move, and the greatest holy leaf is still in the kitchen, waiting for news. So Abdu'l-Bahá arrives at this scene, and he immediately takes control, and he asks Husseini Ashti to go and get some of his own clothes to change the blood-stained clothes of Haji Jafar. And as he's on his way to run this errand, he sprinkles water on the women on the faces of the women who are unconscious so that they can regain consciousness. And he accompanies them into the kitchen. And now the greatest holy leaf sees the 3 people she had sent out come back in together. She's asking, well, tell me the truth. What is the matter? Why are you all so frightened? In the end, Husseini Ashti tells her the whole truth. And then he suggests something kind of silly. He says, let's not tell Baha'u'llah this happened until after Baha'u'llah is eaten. But the greatest holy leaf, who's now in 1868, she's 22 years old. She has really assumed control of the household of the Holy Family. Anything that's not under the purview of Bahíyyih Khánum is her responsibility. And she immediately dismisses Husseini Ashti's terrible idea because there is no protecting Baha'u'llah. Baha'u'llah does not need to be protected. And that she explains to him that people have given their lives to the faith, and this is not something you need to protect Baha'u'llah from. And this really shows the maturity of the greatest holy leaf and how calm she is under pressure, like under pressure of life and death, really. In the end, Haji Jafari Tabrizi recovered 100%. He had missed the carotid artery in his neck. Baha'u'llah convinced him to be treated by a doctor and told him to come to Akká as soon as he was healed, which he would eventually do. So then the family themselves, they need to get to Akká, the place of their 4th exile. And this journey is going to be 1,800 kilometers long, about 1,100 miles. And the first part of the journey is overland from Edirne. It's 1/10 of the journey, so about 100 miles, 160 kilometers. They just travel overland to Gallipoli. And then in Gallipoli, they are going to board a ship, a steamer. This is a 19th century steamer. This is the type of ship that they would have traveled on. And they're going to travel around the coast to a couple of places, and then they're going to cross the Mediterranean to Egypt, Port Said, Jaffa, until Haifa. And then from Haifa, they're going to get to Akká. But this 10-day journey, remember what I said about the length of journeys, this is the worst journey the greatest holy leaf was ever on. But the worst part of it was the last part, which is only 8 hours long. And that was the worst of all the journeys. So to get to Akká, actually, Baha'u'llah and the greatest holy leaf and the family had to go on 3 continents. They went from Europe, where Edirne was, to Africa, where Egypt was, to Asia, where Akká was. And they went from modern-day Turkey to modern-day Greece, to modern-day Egypt, to modern-day Israel. So eventually, they arrived in Haifa on the 31st of August, 1868. They were carried ashore in rowboats, and they stayed in prison in Haifa, according to the greatest holy leaf, for a full day, the men in chains, and then they had an 8-hour sailing nightmare from Haifa to Akká, and this is what happened. It was only 16 kilometers, it was only 10 miles, but it took 8 hours because by this point in the ordeal, says Greatest Holy Leaf, everyone was now sick. And there was no wind the day they sailed. So they sailed 16 kilometers or 10 miles is an eternity if there is no wind and there's beating sun. So Bahíyyih Khánum later said, all were sick from hunger or eating improper food. And this is what's incredible. I myself was a healthy woman up to the time of taking this voyage. Since then, I have never been well. So for the greatest holy leaf to say this about the shortest of all the journeys is astonishing, because the first exile was 1,000 kilometers. The second exile was 2,000 kilometers. The third one was 173 kilometers, I think. But the last one was the worst, and it was entirely by ship. And that was one of the reasons why it was one of the worst. They were confined on a ship altogether. When they arrived in the prison city of Akká on the 31st of August, 1868, a new defining chapter in Bahíyyih Khánum's life was beginning. So finally, after this horrible windless journey under the scorching sun, the exiles arrive at the sea gate in Akká, the dismal end of this exhausting journey. The men are carried on chairs ashore. They enter the sea gate, which you see here. And Bahíyyih Khánum is appalled by what she sees. At the time, there were 9,000 people living in Akká. And Akká was famous because it was the prison city of the Ottoman Empire, where the political dissidents, political detainees, troublemakers, most troublesome criminals, murderers were sent. But the inhabitants of the prison of this city were not much better than the prisoners of the prison city. A large crowd had been whipped into a frenzy before they arrived, and they wanted to see Baha'u'llah. They wanted to see the god of the Persians. And they were threatening, they were aggressive, and the greatest holy leaf said, some said we were to be put in the dungeons and chains, others that we were to be thrown into the sea. The most horrible jests and jeers were hurled at us as we were marched through the city to this dreadful prison. The greatest holy leaf had just crossed the entire Ottoman Empire, and she is now faced with the unknown. The worst was yet to come. 50 years later, the greatest holy leaf looked back on her last place of exile, and she said, imagine, if you can, the overpowering impression made by all this upon the mind of a young girl, such as I was then, 22 years old. Can you wonder that I am serious and that my life is different from those of my countrywomen? Baha'u'llah's fourth exile was the worst of all, not only because of the despicable conditions in the most great prison, but also because of the abominable state of the city of Akká itself, with its poisonous air and its lack of clean water. If you just think, Abdu'l-Bahá had 8 children, and 4 of them died within the prison city because of the foul air and the lack of clean water. The exiles were led through the dirty, narrow streets of Akká to the citadel. And once they entered into the citadel, which we call the most great prison, the doors were slammed shut behind them and huge iron bolts thrown closed. Bahíyyih Khánum recalled in an interview, of my own experience, perhaps this is the most awful. The horrible sufferings of the voyage had reduced me almost to the point of death. Upon that came the seasickness. When she arrived at the most great prison, the smell was so awful that she fainted. And she said, I cannot find words to describe the filth and stench of that vile place. We were nearly up to our ankles in mud in the room in which we were led. The damp close air and the excretions of the soldiers combined to produce horrible odors. Then, being unable to bear more, I fainted. The poor Baha'is, as Bahíyyih Khánum fell to the ground, they caught her before she fell, but there was nowhere to safely put her down. So there was a man in the prison somehow weaving a mat for the Ottoman soldiers, and they grabbed the mat and they laid the greatest holy leaf on the mat. And the mat weaver had been moistening the leaves, the rods or whatever he was weaving the mat with some a pool of water that was on the mud floor, which is just vile. It's just so vile. So in order to revive the greatest holy leaf, a Baha'i dipped a cloth in the dirty water and squeezed it onto her lips. But the water was so foul that it made her faint again. So in the end, they could only refresh her face with the water. She couldn't drink it because it was so vile. And the Holy Family's cell was filled with mud, and this is how they arrived. And over the course of 2 years, their living conditions are going to I hesitate to say improve, but they're going to get a little bit better than that with the mud to the ankles until really the greatest personal tragedy of the greatest Holy Leaf's life happens, which is the martyrdom of Mirza Mihdí. And really, in the 2 years that they spend in the greatest prison, these are the only pieces of information that we have about the greatest Holy Leaf. So that's why I'm going straight to this one. Bahíyyih Khánum and the Holy Family lived as best they could in these inhuman conditions for 2 years. So from 1868 to 1870, Baha'u'llah keeps on revealing his proclamation to the kings and rulers of the world. Abdu'l-Bahá and Mirza Mihdí help Baha'u'llah. They are secretaries. They assist Baha'u'llah with his revelation. And Mirza Mihdí had the habit of climbing the stairs, these stairs here, these narrow stairs to the rooftop. These are 2 views of the same stairs. Here's from the side and here is facing the stairs. And so the reason that the exiles would climb to the top of the roof is because the prison had a flat roof, like many Middle Eastern buildings in the 19th century and still today. And there were some beautiful views. They could see majestic Mount Hermon to the northeast. And then to the west, they could see the pure blue waters of the Mediterranean. And of course, they're being so close to the sea, there would have been wind on the roof. And so it was quite pleasant and beautiful. It was the only nice thing in the prison. And the purest branch, Mirza Mihdí, would spend long hours in prayer and meditation. He was a very, very devout young man, and he would pray for hours every day. And he loved to go on the roof and pace back and forth and pray. Now, this rooftop had a fatal flaw. It was this rectangular, unprotected skylight in the middle of the roof. And what Mirza Mihdí did when he prayed was he would count his steps and avoid the window. So he could pray and walk and pray while counting his steps and not fall through. But on the afternoon of the 22nd of June, 1870, Baha'u'llah informed Mirza Mihdí that he would not need him that day to copy tablets. So Mirza Mihdí climbed to the rooftop around twilight and began chanting the verses of Baha'u'llah's Ode of the Dove, the poem that he revealed in Kurdistan. Mirza Mihdí was transported into such a state of spiritual ecstasy that day he did not keep track of the skylight. He did not count his steps. And he fell through the skylight and impaled himself on an open wooden crate on the floor 34 feet below, 10 meters below, very close to the cell where Bahíyyih Khánum lived with Asíyih Khánum. Mirza Mihdí's body crashed with a deafening sound. And all the Baha'is heard it, and they all ran towards the sound, and Baha'u'llah came out of his room. Baha'u'llah reached his injured son and asked what happened, and Mirza Mihdí simply told his father he had forgotten to count his steps on the roof. The crate had pierced Mirza Mihdí's ribs, and Mirza Mihdí was bleeding profusely. His companions tore off the bloody clothes from his body and carried him to his room. The greatest Holy Leaf would keep these. She'd have the presence of mind to keep them and to offer them as precious relics to the Baha'i archives. The physician who came was unable to treat Mirza Mihdí. Bahíyyih Khánum was absolutely heartbroken when she saw her mother trying to embrace her son and lost consciousness. Mirza Mihdí reached out to hold his unconscious mother in his arms, despite how painful it was for him to make any movement. Before Mirza Mihdí died, Baha'u'llah entered his room and asked his dying son, "Akká, master, what do you wish? Tell me." Instead of asking his father to spare his life, Mirza Mihdí replied, "I wish the people of Baha to attain your presence." Meaning, he wanted Baha'is to be able to come on pilgrimage and reach Baha'u'llah's presence. And Baha'u'llah responded to his dying son, "And so it shall be, God will grant your wish." Mirza Mihdí passed away 22 hours after his fall on the 23rd of June, 1870. when he had breathed his last breath, Baha'u'llah was heard lamenting in the prison, Mihdí, O Mihdí. And thus ended the Holy Family and the Greatest Holy Leaf stay in the Most Great Prison. And they began their life in Akká, part 4. 5 months after Mirza Mihdi's martyrdom, Bahíyyih Khánum and her family were moved into the city of Akká because the Ottoman army requisitioned the barracks. And Mirza Mihdi's ardent prayer on his deathbed that pilgrims would attain Baha'u'llah's presence was about to come true, because now Bahíyyih Khánum's life in Akká had begun, and with that, Baha'u'llah would have a little bit more freedom. For their first year in Akká, the Holy Family moved to 4 different houses in the Muslim and Christian neighborhoods, wherever there was space available, until they arrived in the house of Udi Khamar in September of 1871. From 1870 to 1872, the first 2 years in Akká, Bahíyyih Khánum and her family adjusted to life within the walls of the city prison, and everything was relatively uneventful until 2 years later, in January 1872, when a crisis of unprecedented proportions exploded into their lives. And I'm speaking, of course, of the murder of the covenant breakers. So when Baha'u'llah had been exiled from Edirne to Akká, the Ottoman government had done something a little bit strange. They had split up the Baha'is and the covenant breakers. The majority of the Baha'is had followed Baha'u'llah and been exiled to Akká here. And the majority of the covenant breakers with Mirza Yahya had been exiled to Cyprus here. But the Ottoman government had taken 4 Baha'is and sent them with the covenant breakers to Cyprus. And they had taken 2 covenant breakers and sent them to Akká with the Baha'is. They had sort of mixed the exiles a little bit. So 2 covenant breakers had arrived in Akká at the same time as Baha'u'llah in 1868. They were Sayyid Muhammad, Mirza Yahya's henchman or puppet master, however you want to call him, and his recruit Kaj Kula, Skewcap. But then another man had joined them, Mirza Reza Kuli, the brother of one of the wives of Mirza Yahya. These 3 covenant breakers had actively worked on turning the people of Akká against Baha'u'llah. The Baha'is really could no longer stand the pain and suffering that these 3 covenant breakers were heaping on Baha'u'llah, and the situation was very explosive until January 1872, when after 4 years of the covenant breakers' misdeeds, the Baha'is did something absolutely, it was an act of disobedience that was unparalleled in the annals of Baha'i history. Baha'u'llah had very clearly forbidden them to take any sort of retaliatory action or take vengeance on the covenant breakers. But they murdered them, and immediately several things happened. Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l-Bahá were arrested. The Ottoman officials insisted on getting the keys of the house to search it for weapons. Abdu'l-Bahá was forced to accompany them because he did not want them to go into the house alone. He was in chains. His mother and his sister had to see him in chains. And eventually, Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l-Bahá were released. The 7 murderers, because they did murder the 3 covenant breakers, were arrested for 7 years. And a year after this worst possible event, since they had arrived in the Most Great Prison, like I said, victory follows crisis. Just a year later, Abdu'l-Bahá got married. His wife lived in Esfahan, and she came to the Holy Land at Baha'u'llah's request via Mecca. And she arrived maybe 9 months after the murder. She arrived in September 1872. And their entire journey had been supervised by Baha'u'llah. And this was really an event that was very joyful, especially for Abdu'l-Bahá's sister and his mother. When she arrived, she lived with Baha'u'llah's brother, Mírzá Musa. And after Baha'u'llah gave this young woman whose name was Fatimeh, he gave her the name Munireh Khanum, which is the name we know her as. They were eventually married. The most important wedding gift was a room that their neighbor Ilyas Abbúd opened onto them from this house, the house of Abbúd. And the wedding took place on the very day that he gifted them the room. These are two pictures of Abdu'l-Bahá and Munireh Khanum within a decade of each other, I think. This picture of Abdu'l-Bahá is from 1868, and this picture of Munireh Khanum is from the 1870s. So Abdu'l-Bahá was a slightly older, and Munireh Khanum was slightly younger than they are in the picture, but they're relatively on the same sort of age as when they got married. And so when Abdu'l-Bahá and Munireh Khanum got married, that sort of inaugurated a new era in the life of the Holy Family, which was the house of Abbúd. And with this move into the house of Abbúd, the neighbor Ilyas Abbúd moves out to the countryside, and he rents his house to Baha'u'llah. And as you can see, this room with a balcony, this is a room that has a view of the Mediterranean Sea. This is a painting I love very much from Baha'i in Australia. And you can really see the sea, and sort of like it's imagining the house of Abbúd at the time in the 19th century. And this is the entrance of the house of Abbúd. And they opened two doorways. The Holy Family opened two doorways, one above and one below, and they fused them into a single house. Abdu'l-Bahá, during this time, he begins life as sort of, he's going to become known as the master of Akká. So his responsibilities are growing because he has rented a reception room across from the house of Udi Khamar, which is the house you see here. And as Abdu'l-Bahā's responsibilities grow, as they really in earnest start living in the city of Akká, so do the responsibilities of the greatest holy leaf. And I'm going to explain to you exactly how that happens. So the activities within the faith become increased because now more pilgrims can come, they can receive pilgrims, and the greatest holy leaf begins to devote herself completely to the needs of her family and the needs of her father especially, and the needs of the cause. From early morning until late in the evening, the greatest holy leaf is occupied with the household duties and other duties, and her work becomes kind of like one long prayer. When the family moves into the house of Abbúd, the greatest holy leaf's responsibilities just multiply. She is the head of the household. She takes care of the needs of the pilgrims, the needs of the Baha'is. Her attentions are constant. Let's say it's the middle of the summer and somebody comes and they just are dying of thirst, and all of a sudden a glass of water will come. The greatest holy leaf was out of view. She was always aware of the needs of everyone, and no one was ever forgotten. She managed every single detail of this extremely large, extremely complex household, which extended to giving loving advice to those who needed it or carefully and lovingly preparing food. And now is really the time in her life where she becomes the head of Baha'u'llah's household. Many people of rank, from officials to scholars, seek out Baha'u'llah's presence. And this is despite the fact that Baha'u'llah is under surveillance by the Ottoman authorities. And the greatest holy leaf pays attention, special attention, beyond anything else she does, to the very needs of Baha'u'llah. And she does everything she can to protect him and safeguard him in his social relationships or in his personal needs. During this time, we have a testimony about the greatest holy leaf's smile, and it comes from a really interesting place. It comes from a letter from an essay written by Bahíyyih Nakhshivani for the commemoration of Bahíyyih Khánum's passing in 1982. One of the characteristics of the greatest holy leaf was her ability to endure suffering with the utmost joy reflected on her face. After her passing, Shoghi Effendi's secretary wrote, "Even in the thick of the worst ordeals, she would smile like an opening rose." And Bahíyyih Khánum continues, "It is a smile that lingers with us still, a smile that looks at us with tenderness through the photographs. Within this smile, there is so much of radiance and sorrow, so much of understanding. It is a smile so deep that we might feel it penetrating our inmost hearts." Just as her own heart retained the treasured traces of the heroic age of Baha'i history, so our hearts too are revived and refreshed by those smiles of hers, described by Shoghi Effendi, which have been forever and faithfully imprinted there. This is an important passage because it marks one of the traits of the greatest holy leaf, whose entire life was just really one long life of suffering. But she found a way to feel joy, and a joy that was a genuine joy. And it's almost is very difficult to understand how she did this. 7 years after Baha'u'llah moved into the city of Akká, a new chapter in his life, the last chapter in Baha'u'llah's life, the last 15 years of Baha'u'llah's life, are going to take place in areas of great beauty, and it is Abdu'l-Bahá who is going to make this possible for him. In 1877, Abdu'l-Bahá finds the perfect place for Baha'u'llah in the countryside. It's called the Mansion of Mazrae. It's a beautiful little mansion that you see here that's a little stream that has a little stream close by, surrounded by gardens. And it's, at the time, it's very far from Akká. It's 6.5 kilometers, 4 miles, but it's very far because at the time, the only way to get there was by mule. And it would have taken quite a while to make that distance. After Baha'u'llah lives in Mazrae for 2 years, he moves to his final and most glorious residence, the mansion of Bahíyyih, a palatial mansion that was abandoned because there was an epidemic of the plague and everybody fled the region, and Abdu'l-Bahá was able to rent it for Baha'u'llah. This would be Baha'u'llah's last residence and his most splendid home, with vast and spacious gardens, with groves of fragrant lemon and orange trees. And it's much closer to Akká than Mazrae was. It's half the distance. It's 2 miles north, 3.5 kilometers. So what about Asiyeh Khánum and Bahíyyih Khánum? In 1877, when Baha'u'llah first moved into the countryside, Asiyeh Khánum's health was broken by 25 years of exiles, and she could not travel into the countryside. In 25 years, Asiyeh Khánum had been exiled 4 times. She had to have made a home for Baha'u'llah and the Holy Family in 17 rented houses in 4 countries on 2 continents, 3 continents. She traveled a total of 5,500 kilometers, or 3,400 miles from her native land. And the quarter century, 24 years and 4 months of constant exile, hunger, travel, and impossible living conditions had caused her health to deteriorate so much that by 1877, Asiyeh Khánum could no longer travel. Beyond the fact that her health was broken by so much suffering in 25 years, the Holy Family did not have this. They did not have a howdah in Akká. They would have had to build one, and they had no money to build one. A howdah would have been the only way that Asiyeh Khánum could travel. But honestly, even with a howdah, she was in such poor health, it would have been impossible for her to leave Akká. So we know that the Greatest Holy Leaf did travel to Bahji to see Baha'u'llah, but we don't know how often she went or how she traveled. But we do know she did visit him at least once, if not more. Baha'u'llah always came to Asiyeh Khánum and Bahíyyih Khánum in Akká. When he moved to Mazrai and Bahji, he did not stay there permanently. He stayed there in the spring and summer and spent the winter and fall with his wife and daughter and Abdu'l-Bahá in Akká. And during the last 7 years of Asiyeh Khánum's life, from 1879 to 1886, Baha'u'llah did not only spend long stretches of time with his wife in the house of Abbúd during the winters, but he wrote her loving tablets, one of which is in the archives, speaking about her health. This is a tablet in Baha'u'llah's own hand, but it is revealed for Bahíyyih Khánum because I couldn't find one for Asiyeh Khánum. So I just wanted you to see a tablet that he wrote for his beloved daughter, as we think of the tablet he wrote for his beloved wife. Another thing is happening as Baha'u'llah is living in the countryside is the Holy Family is growing. And this is a source of joy for the Greatest Holy Leaf, because between 1873 and 1892, Abdu'l-Bahá and Munireh Khánum began having children. And in the same house as they are having their children is their mother-in-law, and their sister-in-law and their sister. So everybody is together and the family is growing. The eldest daughter of Abdu'l-Bahá is Asiyeh Khánum, Ziyayeh Khánum, who is the future mother of Shoghi Effendi. This is a photograph of the Greatest Holy Leaf with 3 of the daughters of Abdu'l-Bahá. And this period of time when Baha'u'llah is in the countryside is also a time of very great loss. 3 people in the Holy Family die within a year of each other. First, in 1886, is the passing of Asiyeh Khánum. She had married Baha'u'llah in 1832 when she was around 15 years old, and she had had 7 children with Baha'u'llah, 3 of whom had grown to adulthood, with her youngest boy, Mírzá Mihdí, who had passed away 16 years earlier. Now, Mírzá Mihdí had fallen from a great height, and that is how he passed away. And his mother, it is believed, fell from a ladder, and it was as a result of that fall that his mother died. So his mother also died from a fall. She had a very humble, sweet room in the house of Abbúd, where she had a small table, where she had her prayer books, a pen case, writing papers, and sometimes cut flowers. And she had a very beautiful chanting voice when she chanted prayers. When she passed away, she was surrounded by Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l-Bahá and Bahíyyih Khánum, and she received a funeral very dignified and befitting of her station. And Baha'u'llah unveiled her station after her passing in a tablet filled with his love for her, saying, "O Nawab, O leaf that hath sprung from my tree and been my companion, God hath been and will be pleased with thee, and hath singled thee out for his own self, and chosen thee from among his handmaids to serve him, and has made thee the companion of his person in the daytime and in the night season. He hath made thee to be his companion in every one of his worlds." The person most affected by the passing of Asiyeh Khánum was, of course, Bahíyyih Khánum. She had been her saintly and sacrificial mother's closest helper, and Asiyeh Khánum's passing created a huge vacuum and a deep void in Bahíyyih Khánum's life that nothing would ever fill for the rest of her life. 1 short year after the passing of Asiyeh Khánum, Mírzá Musa, Baha'u'llah's faithful younger brother, passed away. He was 18 months younger than Baha'u'llah. Even as a baby, he had been so attached to Baha'u'llah. He lived 69 years at Baha'u'llah's side. And in his eulogy of Mírzá Musa, Abdu'l-Bahá calls him Baha'u'llah's true brother and his staunch and valued supporter. So for Bahíyyih Khánum, she had grown up with Mirza Musa her entire life. And within a year, she lost both her mother and her uncle. Until the year after her uncle died in 1888, she lost her nephew, Hussein Effendi, who had been such a special, sweet, sweet little boy. He was 4 years old when he passed away. And it was absolutely heartbreaking for the entire family because he was very vivacious, very eager. He was the delight of Baha'u'llah. He used to spend time with Baha'u'llah at Bahji. He used to sleep over there. And Baha'u'llah has mentioned him in several tablets, including this one, which is revealed during his lifetime, but it's very sweet because Baha'u'llah tells him that yesterday we were in Junayneh. Junayneh was one of the gardens of Baha'u'llah. Some pomegranate was found and sent. We instructed Mustafa, should he find something else in the city, to procure it and send it with the pomegranate. A small sum of money was also sent. And after Hussein Effendi passed away, Baha'u'llah revealed his epitaph and several tablets for Abdu'l-Bahá and his wife, Bahíyyih Khánum, to comfort them in their loss. This period in the Greatest Holy Leaf's life in Akká is what the Guardian tells us. This is a very mysterious statement by the Guardian. He says that this is when the Greatest Holy Leaf's powers come into their fullness. It's clear from Shoghi Effendi's eulogy to the Greatest Holy Leaf, written on the 17th of July, 1932, that the time that Baha'u'llah began living in Akká was a shift in her life. He says, Shoghi Effendi says, without any equivocation, that it wasn't until she was imprisoned with Baha'u'llah that she had completely displayed sort of the fullness of her spiritual powers. And these are the words of the Guardian. Not until, however, she had been confined in the company of Baha'u'llah within the walls of the prison city of Akká did she display in the plenitude of her power and in the full abundance of her love for him more gifts that single her out next to Abdu'l-Bahá among the members of the Holy Family as the brightest embodiment of that love which is born of God and of that human sympathy which few mortals are capable of evincing. What's important about this is that this is not the first or the last time that Shoghi Effendi is going to compare the spiritual power of the Greatest Holy Leaf with the spiritual power of Abdu'l-Bahá. In this quote, he says that she is singled out next to Abdu'l-Bahá as among the members of the Holy Family, those that have the brightest embodiment of that love which is born of God, which is a huge statement. But he is teaching us how to see the Greatest Holy Leaf. And continuing on this, I want to talk about two different things before we end today. One is the Greatest Holy Leaf's presence, because one of the powers of the Greatest Holy Leaf is the atmosphere around her physically present. And that's something I'm going to revisit because it's one of the most important aspects of the Greatest Holy Leaf. And the other one is her leadership style, which is also something I'm going to revisit at least once again during this chronology. I wanted to mention that a lot of the photographs that you're going to see in this chronology are from the archives of the United States National Baha'i Community. And so I want to thank them for making them available. This is one of those pictures. One of the most important things to remember about the role of Bahíyyih Khánum in the history of the faith is that there is a component of her role that is essentially spiritual. She was endowed with extraordinary spiritual qualities. First of all, she is the daughter of a manifestation of God. Now, we are used to thinking of Abdu'l-Bahá as very special because he's the son of a manifestation of God, but she is the daughter of the manifestation of God. And in a lot of his statements, Shoghi Effendi says that she is almost like a feminine counterpart to Abdu'l-Bahá. And some of her extraordinary spiritual qualities are her unshakable faith, her profound empathy, her legendary generosity, her extreme tender kindness, but also her very, very comprehensive modern understanding of the covenant of Baha'u'llah. She is extremely deepened in the theology, Baha'i theology and Baha'i history. And she has this very powerful presence, a presence that many, many, many people, especially pilgrims, have recounted had the capacity to create unity. And I don't know about you, but I've never met someone that had that kind of presence, a presence that just being in their orbit, it creates unity. Being close to the greatest holy leaf, being into her presence transformed people. One pilgrim that we don't know who they are, unfortunately, wrote, just to sit and look into the eyes of the greatest holy leaf, to feel that spiritual power which is consciously pouring into the world today is a bounty beyond words and will assist a soul throughout all the worlds. If you go there with a spiritual hunger, even a little freed from self, your heart will be filled to overflowing, and you shall have tasted that water after which one will thirst no more. In 1922 or 23, Shoghi Effendi told May Maxwell as she was leaving Haifa, and this is a picture of May Maxwell, "You are most fortunate to be so near the greatest holy leaf, bodily close to her. I hope that you will be able to receive something of her spirit to take to the friends in America. Her spirit is the remedy for all their troubles." Now, why does Shoghi Effendi say this? Because the troubles of America at that time were disunity. That was one of the reasons that in his early guardianship, Shoghi Effendi left so often, was disunity between the Baha'is. And we just saw that the greatest holy leaf's presence creates unity. That's why he's telling May Maxwell that he hopes she can take some of her spirit to the friends in America, because her spirit, which creates unity, is the remedy for all their troubles. So finally, this is the last section for today. I want to talk to you very briefly about the greatest holy leaf's leadership style, because one of the things I want to try to do with this series is to shift to see the greatest holy leaf as a leader, because she has phenomenal leadership capabilities and qualities, and the Guardian expounds upon them a lot, as well as Dr. Janet Khan, the author of Prophet's Daughter. She has really opened this whole vista of the greatest holy leaf as a leader to the Baha'i world. Bahíyyih Khánum was a born leader. Many of the Baha'is who met the greatest holy leaf were attracted by the powerful atmosphere of her presence, sort of a mixture of strong but gentle authority that gravitated around her. Although the greatest holy leaf had a strong will, she never forced it on anyone. She was never heavy-handed. She never imposed her opinions on anyone. What she needed to accomplish, she did it gently and patiently, carefully and diplomatically, and always smiling. The approach of the greatest holy leaf to leadership was a reflection of her innate sense of organization and her power to create unity. Her approach to anyone, Baha'is, local residents, pilgrims, persons of authority, or enemies of the faith, was always the same: respectful, sensitive, patient. In the words of Dr. Janet Khan, she modeled a leadership style that exemplified nurturance, trust, and encouragement. She was a force for unity and understanding, actively supporting and collaborating with the embryonic spiritual assemblies. This is something we're going to see in a couple of weeks, how the Greatest Holy Leaf worked with local assemblies. But next week, we are going to look at the Greatest Holy Leaf and the center of the covenant, the first 4 years of the ministry of Abdu'l-Bahá. Thank you very much, and I will see you next Sunday.